There are winters that don't just take the harvest, they take the people you love. This is the story of a woman who decided on a cold March morning in the year 1887 that winter would never take another thing from her. Not one more thing, not while she still had breath in her body and two children who needed her. Her name was Hesper Ashcombe. She was 45 years old. She had a girl of 10 named Verity and a boy of 7 named Wren. And on the night her husband died, she made a promise that would change everything. I would say so, but we'll get to that promise in a moment. First, I need to tell you about the cabin. The Ashcombe cabin sat at the western edge of a small settlement called Redbud Crossing, tucked into a fold of land at the foot of the Sawtooth Mountains in what was then the territory of Idaho. Silas Ashcombe had built that cabin with his own hands log by log in the summer of 1872. He was a good builder, a patient man. He measured twice and cut once. The cabin was not poorly made. That is what Hesper would tell herself over and over in the months that followed. The cabin was not poorly made. Silas had done everything right, but sometimes doing everything right is not enough. The winter of 1886 came in slow and cruel. The chinking between the logs shrank in the frost. Wind found the seams. Moisture gathered on the inner walls and ran down onto the packed dirt floor like slow tears. By late December, Silas had a cough. By the second week of January, the cough had roots. Hesper burned wood day and night. She hung Silas's own wool coats against the walls to try to stop the wind. She heated stones in the fire and wrapped them in flannel and tucked them under his blankets. Verity, only 10 that winter, boiled water for tea until her small hands were red and cracked from the steam. Wren, only 7, sat quiet in the corner with his wooden dog watching his father's chest rise and fall. But the harder Hesper worked the fire, the more the walls sweated. The hot air met the cold logs and turned to water, and the water soaked into everything, into the bedding, into Silas's nightshirt, into his lungs. He died on the 3rd of March just before dawn. Hesper did not scream. She did not fall to her knees. She had grown up on a farm outside Cincinnati, the daughter of a cooper. Her father had taught her that grief was a private thing, meant to be carried in silence. She simply sat by the bed for a long time. She held Silas's hand until it was cold. Then she stood up, walked to the shelf above the stove, and looked at the 3 tin cups that lined it. Hers, Silas's, and a smaller one that Wren had drunk from since he was old enough to hold a cup. She reached out and turned Silas's cup so that the handle faced the wall. She did not want Wren to reach for it by mistake. She did not want to see it either. Then she walked back to her children and she held them and she whispered into their hair over and over the same 3 words. I have you, I have you, I have you. She would remember that morning for the rest of her life. The gray light coming through the frost on the window, the smell of damp wood and cold ashes, and that turned cup on the shelf, a small betrayal of hope that she could not undo. Before we go any further, I want to know something. Where are you listening to this story right now? Are you in your kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold on the counter? Are you sitting on your porch watching the light change in the afternoon? Are you lying in bed at the end of a long day? Wherever you are, I'm glad you're here with me. And if this story starts to find its way into your heart the way I hope it will, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button because we're just at the beginning. And Hesper's story hasn't even really started yet. Now, let me tell you what happened next. The spring of 1887 came late to Silverthorne Hollow. That was the name folks gave to the wide, sloped valley that held Redbud Crossing. Hesper worked. She worked because if she stopped, she would think, and if she thought, she would break. She had 2 children who watched her every morning to see what shape their world would take that day. She had chickens to feed. She had a milk cow named June, who did not care that her husband was dead, so she picked up his tools. The men in Redbud Crossing were not unkind, exactly. Neighbors came by in the first weeks with baskets of biscuits and jars of preserves, but by June the comfort had thinned. By July, Reverend Amos Hollingsworth was making regular visits. Reverend Hollingsworth was 62. A lean man with iron-gray sideburns and the kind of eyes that always seemed to be measuring you. He had been the preacher for 11 years. He believed deeply that God had placed men to lead and women to follow. He would sit at Hesper's kitchen table, drink her tea, and speak of concern. Concern for the children, concern for her health. He mentioned more than once that Hesper had a widowed cousin back in Ohio who might welcome her return. He mentioned that there were unmarried men in Redbud Crossing who might be willing to consider her circumstance. Hesper smiled. She poured more tea. She kept her hands folded in her lap. And when he was gone, she would say to the empty kitchen, quiet enough that the children could not hear, "I am not a circumstance." At night, she would take out a folded letter from a drawer in the pine chest at the foot of her bed. It was the last letter Silas had ever written to her from the next room in the fever days before he could no longer hold a pen. It was mostly practical. Where to find the deed to the property. Which fields to plant. How to handle the account at Kettleman's General Store. But at the bottom, in a hand that had grown weak, he had written a single line. "You are stronger than you know, Hess. You always have been. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. She read that line every night, and every night in some quiet, secret room of her heart she did not believe him, because she had failed him. She had known he was cold, she had known the cabin was damp, and she had not known what to do about it. She had thought that more fire was the answer. She had been wrong, and Silas had paid the price. Grief rarely comes alone. It comes hand in hand with guilt, and the two of them together are a heavier weight than either would be by itself. Hesper Ashcombe carried both of them that whole long summer. It was Wren who almost broke her. In the last week of June, the boy came in from the yard with a small dry cough. Nothing much. He kept trying to tell her about a bird's nest he had found in the elderberry bush. And did she want to come see it, Ma, please, before the birds came back? But Hesper heard the cough, and she froze. She was standing at the stove, stirring a pot of beans, and her hand stopped, and the wooden spoon hung there in the steam. Because that was how it had started with Silas. Just a dry cough, just a small thing. She turned around slowly and looked at her son. Wren stood in the doorway, with mud on his knees, and a smear of something purple across his cheek. He had Silas's blue eyes and Silas's stubborn cowlick at the crown of his head, and when he saw his mother's face, his smile faded. Ma, he said, are you cross with me? Hesper set down the spoon. She crossed the room in 3 steps and picked him up, mud and all. She pressed her cheek against his hair. He was warm, but not hot. No, my sweet, she whispered, I am not cross with you at all. But that afternoon she saddled the mare and rode down to a small cabin that stood alone in a stand of aspen trees. That cabin belonged to Lavinia Threadgood. Lavinia was 58 years old, and she was in the plain speech of Silverthorn Hollow, a granny woman. She caught babies, she set bones, she knew every plant that grew between the creek and the ridge line. She had been the closest friend of Silas's mother when Silas was still a boy. She was the least sentimental woman Hesper had ever met, and she was the only person in the world Hesper still trusted with the truth about how frightened she was. Lavinia examined Wren on her front porch. She listened to his chest with a small horn trumpet. She looked at his throat, then she straightened up. Hay fever, she said. Nothing more. The dust from the mowing sets him off. Hesper let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Her knees felt loose. Lavinia sent Wren inside for a piece of hard candy. Then she took Hesper's hands in her own. Hesper Ashcombe, she said, look at me. Hesper looked at her. You did not kill Silas? Hesper tried to pull her hands away. Lavinia held on. You did not kill him. The cabin killed him. The damp killed him. And until the day you understand that in your bones, you will never truly live again. Do you hear me? Hesper nodded once. Good. Now come inside and drink some tea. You are getting thin, and thin women make bad decisions. Hesper laughed. It was a small, cracked sound, and it startled her because she had not laughed in months. She sat down on Lavinia's porch step, and she laughed, and then she cried, and then she laughed again. Lavinia sat down beside her and did not say a word. She just put an arm around Hesper's shoulders and let her come apart at last in the safety of another woman's presence. That was the day something began to shift. The end of July brought a hot, bright week. Hesper took the children and Barnaby, their old herding dog, up the slope of the sawtooths to pick huckleberries. They went up along a trail Silas had shown her years before. Wren complained about his legs being tired, but Verity carried the second basket without a word. That was Verity. She had gone quiet after her father's death, and she had begun to take on small adult burdens without being asked. They reached the huckleberry slope by late morning. Barnaby dozed. Wren ate more berries than he put in the basket, and his mouth turned a rich, deep purple. The storm came out of nowhere. That is how it is in mountain country. The sky can be the pure, clean blue of a robin's egg 1 hour, and the next hour the clouds pile up behind the peaks like gray wool. Hesper saw the wind before she felt it. Verity, Wren, baskets. Now they ran. Silas had shown her a place once, a shallow cave in a shelf of granite tucked into the hillside, where a spring seeped out through the rocks. He had said, Hess, if you are ever caught up here in weather, you make for this place. She had marked it. She led the children up the last rocky stretch just as the first hard drops of rain began to fall. They ducked under the low overhang of stone and pressed back into the darker space beyond. They sat. Verity pulled Wren close against her side. Barnaby shook himself off. The rain drummed on the stone above them, and Hesper noticed something. Outside the cave, the temperature had dropped. She could see her own breath. Inside, it was cool, but not cold. It was cool the way a root cellar is cool. She reached down and pressed her palm against her canteen. It was the same temperature it had been an hour ago. Verity noticed. Verity noticed everything. She looked at her mother, and then at the mouth of the cave where the rain was hammering the granite. Ma, Verity said quietly, it is drier in here than our house was last winter. Hesper turned to look at her daughter. The rain outside was slashing sideways. Inside it might as well have been a September afternoon. Something turned over in Hesper's chest. It was not an idea, not yet. It was the beginning of an idea, the shape of one. She did not say anything to Verity. She reached out and put her hand on top of her daughter's hand, and they sat together listening to the storm. When it broke, the three of them climbed down the mountain, wet-footed and berry-stained. Just before they turned in at the gate, Verity looked up at her mother. "Ma," she said, "that cave, could a person stay there?" Hesper looked down at her daughter. She did not answer, not then. The trouble with Prosper Kettleman started, as trouble often does, with a bag of sugar. Prosper Kettleman was 40 years old. He had come to Redbud Crossing a little less than 2 years before, in the autumn of 1885. He had bought the general store from old Cornelius Ashby. He had arrived with a woman he introduced as his wife, Delphine, a slender, dark-haired woman with sad eyes who never quite met your gaze. Prosper was handsome in a smooth, careful way. He dressed better than a storekeeper had any real business dressing. He gave candy to children. He asked after everybody's health by name. The women of Silverthorn Hollow, for the most part, thought he was charming. Hesper Ashcombe had never quite trusted him. Silas had felt it too. Silas had said once at supper, "Hess, that Kettleman fellow watches the valley the way a hawk watches a chicken yard." She had remembered that line often since Silas had died. In early August, Prosper Kettleman came to call. He rode up on a fine sorrel horse in the middle of a Thursday afternoon. He walked up to the porch with his hat in his hand and his face arranged in respectful concern. Hesper met him at the door. She did not invite him inside. Prosper spoke to her for a long time on that porch about the burdens of a woman alone, about the difficulty of managing a homestead without a man, about how the winter to come would surely be harder than the last. He proposed in the most delicate terms to buy a portion of the Ashcombe land. Just the western quarter, he said, just enough to ease her burden. He would pay a fair price. Hesper thanked him for his concern, and she told him that the land was not for sale. Prosper Kettleman smiled at her. It was a small, patient smile. "Mrs. Ashcombe," he said. "Winter is a long conversation out here. I do not think we have finished ours yet." He tipped his hat. He left a small sack of sugar on the porch railing. "A gift," he said. Hesper stood on the porch and watched him ride away. Her hand tightened on the doorframe until her knuckles went white. That evening she took the sack of sugar and set it on the kitchen table. She stared at it for a long time. Then she opened the drawer where she kept the small notebook in which she recorded every purchase she made at the general store. She had kept that notebook faithfully since the first year of her marriage. She flipped it open. She read down the list. Every purchase was there in her own neat hand. Flour on the 12th of July, salt on the 20th, kerosene on the 3rd of August. There was no sugar on the list. She had not bought sugar since Silas died. She sat very still. Because when she had last been at the general store 3 days before, she had happened to see Prosper's own account book open on the counter. She had seen her own name printed in his tidy hand, and she had seen a row of small purchases she did not remember making. She had thought at the time that she must have forgotten. She thought otherwise now. That night she felt something rise up in her that was not tears, but was worse than tears. It was a cold, hard clarity. Prosper Kettleman was building a case against her. He was papering her account with purchases she had never made, so that when winter came and money grew tight, he could produce the ledger and say, "Why, Mrs. Ashcombe, you already owe me more than you can pay." And then he would offer her a fair price for a portion of her land. She did not know how he had chosen her. Perhaps because Silas was dead. Perhaps because her land lay between two other properties he might already have his eye on. She did not need to know. She only needed to understand that she was in a fight now, and she had not chosen it, but she was not going to lose it. She stood up. She walked to the shelf above the stove. She looked at the 3 tin cups. Silas's cup was still turned to the wall. She reached out slowly, and she turned it back around. "You saw this coming," she said softly. "Didn't you?" She sat down at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil. Wool, firewood, rope, nails, iron sheeting. The idea in the fog was no longer in the fog. The last week of August, Hesper rode up to the cave alone. She left the children with Lavinia. She took a spirit thermometer her father had given her the year she married Silas. She took a pencil, a notebook, a canteen, bread and cheese. She took Silas's old surveyor's compass. She reached the cave in the early afternoon. She set the thermometer down at the deepest part of the cave and stepped back. She sat on the stone bench and ate her bread and cheese while she waited. She looked at the cave the way a woman looks at a room she is thinking of moving into. She noted the shape, the height of the ceiling, the way the entrance faced almost due southeast, sheltered from the killing north winds. After a full hour, she got up and walked over to the thermometer. 46 degrees. Outside, the air had been near 80. She stared at the thermometer for a long time. She did not know the words for what she had just seen. She had never heard the phrase thermal mass. She would not have known what it meant if someone had said it to her, but she understood the thing itself. The stone did not fight the summer. It did not try to be cool. It simply refused to become hot as fast as the air around it, which meant in the winter it would refuse to become cold as fast as the air around it, too. She stood on the mountainside with the thermometer in her hand. She thought about Silas, about the water running down the walls of the cabin, about the fire she had built up higher and higher, thinking heat was the answer, not understanding that heat without dry air, without still air, without something to hold it was just moisture and misery. She thought about her children. She thought about Prosper Kettleman. She said out loud to the mountain, "Watch me." That evening she sat her children down at the kitchen table. She put a plate of biscuits and molasses between them. Barnaby lay across her feet. "I want to tell you both something, and I want you to listen carefully. Your father died last winter because our cabin was cold and damp. That is the plain truth of it. I am not going to lose either of you the same way, so this winter when the cold comes, we are not going to sleep in this cabin. We are going to sleep somewhere else." Wren's eyes were very wide. Where Ma? There is a place up on the mountain. Your father showed it to me a long time ago. It is a cave in the rock. Do you remember the day of the storm when we picked huckleberries? Wren blinked. Are we going to live like bears? Hesper smiled. It was the first time in a long time. "No, my sweet, we are not going to live like bears. We are going to let the mountain do the work that the cabin could not do." Wren looked at Verity, uncertain. Verity was looking at her mother, and there was something in her face Hesper had not seen in a long time. A kind of steadiness. "I understand, Ma," Verity said. "I have been thinking about it since that day. I was hoping you were thinking about it too." Hesper reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "We are going to be all right," she said. "Both of you. We are going to be all right." Wren said, "Can Barnaby come?" "Of course Barnaby can come." "Then all right," he said with the dignity of a 7-year-old giving his approval. "But I want to bring my wooden dog too." "You may bring anything you like." That night in the quiet room, Hesper made her second promise. The first on the night Silas died had been to her children. This one was to herself. "I will not let another winter make a widow of anyone in this house." Let me stop the story for just a moment. Do you think Hesper was foolish? A woman of 45 alone, moving her 2 small children into a cave in the mountains? Do you think she had lost her wits to grief? Or do you think she was doing the bravest thing a mother could do? I would love to know what you think. Write me a word or two in the comments, because I have known women like Hesper. I bet you have too. Now, let me tell you about the men who tried to stop her. September came in soft and gold. Hesper began to move. She brought wool up to the cave. She had shorn her own 2 sheep in June, and she had a good store of raw fleece in the barn, still greasy with lanolin. She rolled the fleeces into tight bundles and lashed them onto the mule. She brought firewood, dry pine cut and split in July, juniper which burned slower and hotter. She brought rope, she brought canvas, she brought lengths of pine board she had asked to have, milled at Whitfield's sawmill. That is how she came to know Orrin Whitfield. Orrin Whitfield was 48 years old. He had run the sawmill for 12 years. He was a widower himself. His wife had died in childbirth 3 years back, and the baby with her. He had not been the same man since. She rode down to the sawmill in the 3rd week of September with a list of the boards she needed. Orrin came out of the mill in his work apron. He was a tall man, quiet, with a weathered face and dark hair going gray at the temples. He read her list without a word. Then he looked up at her. "Mrs. Ashcombe," he said, "may I ask what you are building?" "A shelter," she said. "Up on the mountain, in a cave." Orrin Whitfield went very still. "For the winter." "Yes." "With the children." "Yes." He was quiet for a beat. "Silas told me once about a cave up on the Huckleberry Slope. He said it was a good place. He said he had shown it to you." Hesper's throat tightened. She had not expected the sound of Silas's name from another man's mouth. "He did," she said. Orrin looked down at the list in his hand. "Mrs. Ashcombe Silas was a friend of mine. He was a better friend than I have been to his family since he died. I am sorry for that. It is not something I can undo. But I would like to do this for you. The boards, on the house, and I would like to bring them up to you myself." Hesper felt her eyes sting. She did not let them fill. "Mr. Whitfield, I do not need charity. If you do this work for me, I will pay you for it." Orrin nodded. "That is fair, but I would like to bring the boards up myself all the same. That part I will not charge you for. Consider it something I owed Silas and did not get the chance to pay." Hesper looked at him. She saw in his face that this was not a man trying to charm her. This was a tired man who carried a debt in his own heart and was trying, in his own quiet way, to set a piece of it down. She nodded. "All right, Mr. Whitfield, I would be grateful." That same week, Reverend Hollingsworth made his fourth visit. He sat at her kitchen table. He refused her offer of tea. Mrs. Ashcombe, there has been talk in the settlement. You are said to be moving supplies up to a cave. You are said to be planning to sleep there with the children through the winter. I am. I have come here today in Christian concern to tell you plainly, this will not do. A woman cannot raise children in a hole in the ground. It is not fitting, it is not safe, and it is not decent. Hesper sat across from him. She thought about the last winter, about Silas's chest rattling, about her son's hay fever cough that had frozen her hand on a wooden spoon in June. Reverend, she said at last. Her voice was even and level. When Silas was sick, who sat by his bed, when he had the fever, who wiped his forehead, who held his hand at 3 a.m, when he cried out, Mrs. Ashcombe, it was not the settlement, it was me. I sat by that bed for 6 weeks. I did everything I knew how to do, and I lost him anyway. And I have come to understand what killed him. It was the cabin, the wet walls, the cold that would not go away. And now you come into my house and tell me it is not decent for me to move my children somewhere warmer and drier. She leaned forward. Decent is what keeps children alive, Reverend. That is my only measure now. The Reverend's face had gone a slow, angry red. He stood up. I will pray for you, Mrs. Ashcombe. You do that. He left. That evening she went to check on Wren. She found him in his small bed by the stove, and his cheeks were flushed. She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead. It was warm. Not hot, but warm. Verity came into the room behind her. She stood in the doorway in her nightgown. Ma, she said, her voice was very small, I do not want to sleep in this house one more winter. Hesper turned. Verity was 11 now, and she was standing there with her small chin set the way her father's used to set, and she was telling her mother the plain truth. Hesper crossed the room and pulled Verity into her arms, and she held her tightly, and she looked over her daughter's head at the shelf above the stove at the 3 tin cups. Silas's cup stood upright now where she had turned it back the night she understood about Prosper Kettleman. She looked at it a long time. We are going to the cave, she said quietly. Sooner than I planned. We are going next week. Verity nodded against her shoulder. He is going to come with us, Hesper said. Verity pulled back, puzzled. Wren, your father. Verity understood. Her eyes filled, and she pressed her forehead against Hesper's chest. Hesper crossed the room and took Silas's tin cup down from the shelf. It was cool in her hand. It had a small dent in the rim where he had dropped it years ago on the day Wren was born. She wrapped it in a piece of clean linen. She placed it in the top of the trunk she was going to carry up to the cave in the morning. He is coming with us all the way. Outside the window, the September wind moved through the pines. The winter was coming, and Hesper Ashcombe was ready to meet it. The first week of October came in with a hard frost. That day the work in the cave began in earnest. Hesper rose before dawn. She dressed the children in their warmest clothes. She pulled on Silas's old canvas coat. Then the 4 of them and Barnaby walked up the mountain. Verity carried a coil of hemp rope. Wren carried his wooden dog and his own tin cup. Hesper led the mule. When they reached the cave, Hesper stood at the mouth of it and looked in. She saw the cave as a home. She saw the corner where Wren would sleep. She saw the place where the stove would sit. She saw all of it laid out in her mind like a map. She turned to her children. All right, let us make a house. The first job was the ceiling. Hesper took a lodgepole pole she had cut. She walked slowly along the length of the ceiling, tapping. Solid stone answered with a sharp, clean sound. Loose stone answered with a duller sound. She found 3 places where the sound was wrong. She pried each one down with an iron bar and let it fall. Wren helped her drag the pieces out. When they were done, Hesper tapped along the whole length again. Nothing but bell tones. Wren looked up at his mother. Ma, are you not scared of caves? She squatted down to his level. There are things I am scared of, but this stone is not one of them. This stone has been here a long time. It knows how to hold on. Wren considered this. All right, then I am not scared either. That was the evening Verity found the blanket. They were unpacking a trunk. At the very bottom, wrapped in brown paper, was a red-striped wool blanket. Verity lifted it out. Her breath caught. Ma. Hesper turned. Her hand went slowly to her mouth. She had woven that blanket herself on the loom that had come west with her from Cincinnati in the first year of her marriage. Red stripes on cream, warm as a fire. Silas had loved it. He had always pulled it up first on cold nights. She had not been able to look at it since he died. Verity held the blanket in her arms. I thought maybe we could use this for the curtains. It is warm. Hesper crossed the cave slowly. She knelt and took the blanket in her own hands. She could smell it faintly. Clean wool and cedar, and underneath, so faint she might have imagined it the smell of Silas. She held it against her cheek for one long breath. Then she folded it carefully. No, sweetheart, this blanket is not going to be a curtain. This blanket is going to be your bed, yours and your brother's. Your father would have wanted it that way. Verity looked at her. Then Verity did something she had not done since her father died. She began to cry. Not loud, not big, just a small, quiet crying. Hesper set the blanket down on the trunk. She took her daughter into her arms. Wren wandered in a minute later. He stopped when he saw them. He came over and put his arms around them both without asking any questions. The three of them stood there like that, in the dim gold of a lantern, in a cave in a mountain, with a red striped blanket folded on a trunk beside them, and Hesper Ashcombe understood in that moment that a house is not a set of walls. A house is the people you hold wherever they happen to be standing. I want to stop here for just a moment. Maybe you have a blanket like that yourself, a quilt your grandmother made, a shawl your mother wore, something so small that no one else would know why it matters. If you have something like that in your house right now, would you do me a small kindness? Would you go and touch it at some point today and think of the person who gave it to you? And if you feel like it, tell me about them in the comments, just their name. Now let me tell you about how a stubborn woman built a doorway. Orrin Whitfield came up to the cave with the milled boards on a cold, bright morning in the second week of October. He came alone with 2 mules and his own tools, a hand plane, a set of chisels, a small keg of iron nails that he set down without a word and did not ask her to pay for. He walked the length of the cave. He looked at the ceiling she had brought down. He looked at the drainage channel she had cut. Then he looked at Hesper. Mrs. Ashcombe, you have done more work here than most men would have done. Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. Where do you want the door frame? She showed him. She had understood that the cave's entrance was too wide. What she wanted was a kind of little room right at the mouth of the cave, a vestibule about 4 feet deep. The outer door would sit on one side, the inner door would sit on the other. They would not line up. This meant the wind would have to turn a corner before it could reach the living space, and the wind, she had noticed, did not like to turn corners. She explained all of this. Orrin listened, standing still, his hat in his hand. Mrs. Ashcombe, may I ask where you learned to think like a builder? Hesper felt her cheeks color. She had not blushed in a long time. My father was a cooper. Back in Cincinnati, he made barrels. He used to tell me that anything that can hold whiskey through a Cincinnati winter can hold anything. He taught me to think about seams, about where air wants to go. Orrin Whitfield smiled. It was a small smile, but it was the first one Hesper had ever seen on his face, and it changed him. Your father sounds like a good teacher. He was. Wren, who had been listening from a corner where he was supposed to be counting nails, piped up. Mr. Orrin, are you going to stay for supper? Hesper's face went hot. Wren, Ma, he brought all the boards himself. I think we should feed him. Orrin Whitfield's shoulders were shaking slightly. He was laughing. She had not heard a man laugh in her house in a year and a half. Well, she said, if Mr. Whitfield can stay, we would be glad to have him. Beans and cornbread would suit me fine. They worked all afternoon. By the time the sun was slanting low, the vestibule was framed and packed. The offset entrance took shape. Hesper stepped outside and looked at what they had made. It was ugly from the outside. Hesper did not care. She lit a candle and went inside, and she set the candle down and watched the flame. The wind was up outside. The flame barely trembled. Verity came in behind her. Ma, the wind does not bite in here anymore. Hesper closed her eyes for a second. No, sweetheart, it does not. That evening, as promised, Orrin Whitfield came down to the cabin for supper. Hesper made beans, cornbread, and stewed apples. She set a 4th place at the table, which was a thing she had not done since Silas died. Orrin ate slowly and politely. He asked Verity about her books. He asked Wren about his wooden dog. When he stood up to go, she walked him out to the porch. The night was cold. The stars were very bright. Mrs. Ashcombe? Yes. I did not know what to say to you after Silas died. I meant to come many times, and I did not come. I told myself you would want to be alone, but the truth is I did not know how to look at you, because when I looked at you, I saw my Cora, and it was too much for me. I am not making excuses. I should have come. I did not. I am sorry. Hesper stood in the doorway. Mr. Whitfield, I did not want you to come. I did not want anyone to come, so it is possible you did the right thing without knowing it. He looked at her. You will let me know when you need more boards. I will. He walked to his horse. Hesper stood on the porch until the sound of the hooves was gone. Then she went back inside and cleared the table. She did not turn Silas's cup to the wall that night. She left it standing. The following week, everything nearly fell apart. Prosper Kettleman came up to the cave. He did not come alone. He came riding with a man in a black coat who Hesper did not recognize, and behind them on a slower horse came the county sheriff, a heavy-set man named Marcus Thorne. Hesper set down the hatchet she had been splitting kindling with. She walked out to meet them. Prosper dismounted, first smooth and unhurried, with the same small, polite smile. Mrs. Ashcombe, may I introduce Mr. Prewitt Corley of Boise. Mr. Corley is an attorney, and of course you know Sheriff Thorne. Hesper nodded to the sheriff. He nodded back, uncomfortable. He did not want to be there. Prosper took a folded paper from his coat. Mrs. Ashcombe, it has come to my attention that this cave may not lie within the bounds of your late husband's homestead. The Territorial Land Office in Boise has records that suggest this parcel is unclaimed, which would mean, of course, that you have been building on land that does not belong to you. He held out the paper. His smile was very gentle. I am prepared to be generous. I would be willing to purchase this parcel from the Territorial Office and lease it back to you at a reasonable rate. Or, if you prefer, we could come to another arrangement, perhaps involving the western quarter of your homestead. Hesper looked at the paper without taking it. She looked at Sheriff Thorne. Sheriff, is that paper real? Sheriff Thorne shifted in his saddle. Mrs. Ashcombe, I am not an attorney, but the paper appears to be a certified statement from the Territorial Land Office. Hesper thought about how easy it would be to lose everything, not because she had done anything wrong, but because a man in a fine coat had produced a piece of paper, and then she heard a horse coming up the trail. Orrin Whitfield rode up at a hard trot. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped. Mrs. Ashcombe, may I speak? She nodded. Orrin turned to Prosper. Mr. Kettleman, I heard in town that you were riding up here this morning with an attorney, so I went to my office at the mill and I found something you should see. He reached into his coat and drew out an oilcloth-wrapped bundle. He unwrapped it. This is a certified copy of Silas Ashcombe's homestead patent, filed in April of 1876. I keep a copy at the mill because Silas asked me to hold one in case anything ever happened to the original. The boundary description is very clear. It runs from the creek up to the ridge line. It includes this cave. He handed the document to Sheriff Thorne. Sheriff Thorne read it, then he read it again. He looked at Prosper Kettleman. This appears to be a legitimate patent. I would say the cave falls within Mrs. Ashcombe's property. Prosper Kettleman's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes did. Well, that is a happy discovery. There must have been some confusion at the land office. Please, Mrs. Ashcombe, accept my apologies. He tipped his hat. He rode away. Sheriff Thorne lingered a moment. He leaned down in his saddle and spoke low. Mrs. Ashcombe, that paper he showed you did not come from Boise. Not from any office I know. I would keep your children close, and I would keep your doors locked. He rode down the trail. Hesper stood on the mountainside with Orrin beside her. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from rage. Mrs. Ashcombe, Mr. Whitfield, he is not done. No, but neither am I. They finished the vestibule that week. They hung the curtains 2 layers with 5 inches of still air between. They built the sleeping platform 16 inches off the stone floor with pine slats and a layer of dry sweet grass, and then 2 layers of wool, and then the red-striped blanket on top. They built the wood rack deep in the back of the cave. They brought up the little iron stove Hesper had bought from an assay cabin. Orrin helped her set it in place well away from the sleeping area, with the stovepipe rising up through a hole they had cut in the granite and lined with sheet iron and clay. The first fire burned for 2 hours. Hesper watched everything. She watched the temperature in the cave rise from 46 degrees to 49 to 52, and then she noticed the wall. There was a thin film of moisture on the stone behind the stove. She stopped everything. She sat down on the sleeping platform. She rested her head in her hands. Verity came and sat beside her. Ma, is something wrong? The wall is wet. Verity frowned. What does that mean? Hesper looked at her daughter. It means we found a mistake. It means we found a mistake in October before you had to sleep next to it in January. It means we did our job. The next day, Hesper pulled the stove 7 inches farther out from the wall. She and Orrin stacked a shield of loose granite behind it with small gaps at the bottom and sides so air could rise between the shield and the wall. She lit another fire. She watched the wall. It stayed dry. She wrote in her notebook, outside 41, inside 53, fire out 3 hours, still 49, wall dry. She looked over at Verity, who was sitting on the sleeping platform reading, and at Wren, who was building a fort out of firewood, and at Barnaby, who was asleep. She said softly, "We are going to be all right." Delphine Kettleman came to the cave for the first time on a gray afternoon in the middle of November. Hesper did not hear her coming. She was inside checking the seals on the vestibule when Barnaby stood up and looked toward the door. He did not growl. That was the strange part. Hesper stepped outside. Delphine Kettleman stood at the mouth of the cave. She had walked up the trail, not ridden. Her boots were caked in mud. She was thinner than Hesper remembered. "Mrs. Ashcombe, may I come in for a moment?" Hesper stood aside. Delphine ducked into the vestibule. She stepped through the inner curtains. She stopped and looked at the space around her. Her mouth opened just slightly. Hesper watched her look at the sleeping platform, the wool curtains, the small stove, the dry stack of firewood, the wooden cover over the spring basin, the neat sweep of the stone floor. Delphine's eyes filled with tears. "You have made a home." Hesper did not know what to say. Delphine sat down on the wooden bench Orrin had built. Her hands were shaking. "Mrs. Ashcombe, my husband does not know I am here. I gathered." Delphine opened her canvas bag. She took out a small ledger. "He has done this to 6 other families. Not just you. 6. He has been building false debts in his ledger, small purchases, bags of flour they never bought, yards of muslin they never took, small enough that no one has noticed. Every family in the valley owes him more than they think they do. He is going to start calling in the debts this winter when the cold makes people desperate, when they cannot pay. Hesper took the ledger. Her name was near the top. Beside it, a list of purchases she had never made. Below her name were other names: Whitfield, Ashby, Thorne, Threadgood, every single one of them. Hesper closed the ledger. Why are you bringing this to me? Delphine looked at the fire, then at Hesper. Because you moved into a cave, because everyone in the valley said you had gone mad, and I watched you carry those bundles up the mountain day after day, and I thought to myself, that is not a mad woman, that is a woman who has decided not to lose anymore, and I thought if she can do that, then perhaps... She stopped. Hesper waited. I have been trying, Mrs. Ashcombe. I have been trying to decide for a long time whether I could be a woman like that, and every time I decided I could not, I thought about your children, and I could not sleep. So I brought you this. Hesper looked at her. She saw in Delphine's face the same look she had seen in her own face after Silas died, the look of a woman who has stopped believing she is allowed to want anything. She crossed the cave and poured hot water into 2 tin mugs, and she dropped a pinch of dried mint into each. She sat down beside Delphine. Mrs. Kettleman, drink this and tell me everything you know. I want to pause here again. Has there ever been a woman in your life who helped you in secret, someone who did not stand on the porch or make a speech, but who slipped something into your hand at the right moment and asked for nothing back? If there was, I hope you will tell me about her, just her name, because those women, the quiet ones, are the ones who hold up the world. Now let me tell you what happened at Hesper's kitchen door on the last day of November. The Reverend came back. He did not come alone this time. He came with 3 of the women from the church: Sister Marietta Poe, Sister Winifred Combs, and Sister Bettina Crane. They rode up in a wagon on a gray afternoon. Hesper was in the kitchen when she heard them. She went to the door. The Reverend was holding a piece of paper. Mrs. Ashcombe, may we come in? She stood aside. The Reverend held up his paper. I have here a petition. It has been signed by 14 members of the congregation. It asks the county to place your 2 children in the care of a Christian household for the duration of the winter. Hesper stared at him. You want to take my children? I want to protect them, Mrs. Ashcombe. From what? From a mother who is not in her right mind. Hesper felt her legs go cold. Reverend Hollingsworth, my children are healthy. My children are fed. My children are loved. My children are warm at night. You have no right. The county will decide what is right. And who put this petition in front of the county? The Reverend's mouth tightened. Mr. Kettleman was kind enough to arrange the paperwork. Of course he was. But the door behind her opened. Lavinia Threadgood walked in. She had a leather satchel over her shoulder. She had come in through the back without knocking, because Lavinia never knocked at Hesper's door. Reverend, Lavinia said pleasantly. The Reverend turned. He blinked. Sister Threadgood, I heard there was a gathering here today. I thought I might come and lend my professional opinion. She set the satchel down on the kitchen table. She took out 3 sheets of paper covered in her own careful handwriting. Reverend, these are my records of Wren Ashcombe's health for the past 8 months. In April, he had a persistent cough. In June, he had hay fever. In September, he was healthy. In November, he is stronger than any child I have seen in this valley his age. She held out the papers. The Reverend did not take them. Reverend, you believe his mother is unfit. I have been in the practice of medicine for 32 years. I have delivered every child born in this valley in the last decade. Hesper Ashcombe is doing something that none of you would have the courage to try. And I will testify to that in any court in this territory. Silence. The Reverend set his jaw. Sister Threadgood, this is not a medical matter. This is a matter of decency. Then let us speak of decency. Lavinia's voice went cold. Reverend Hollingsworth, when Silas Ashcombe was dying last winter, where were you? I came to pray with him. You came once for 20 minutes on the 2nd day of March. I was in that cabin every day for 3 weeks. So was this woman. She sat by that bed. She held his hand. She washed his body when he died. And now you propose to take her children away because she has decided not to let anyone else in her family die of the damp. She looked at him. Whose care did you have in mind for those children, Reverend? Which household? The Reverend did not answer. Was it perhaps... Lavinia said, the Kettleman household? Sister Bettina made a small sound. The Reverend's face went white. Lavinia looked at the Reverend and the 3 sisters. You may go now. They went. Sister Bettina paused at the door and looked back at Hesper as if she wanted to say something. She did not say it. She left. Hesper sank down onto the kitchen bench. Lavinia sat down beside her. After a long minute, Hesper looked up. They would have taken them. They would have tried. He is helping Kettleman. He is a man who has spent 40 years telling other people how to live. He has forgotten how to listen. Hesper laughed weakly. Hesper, you are not alone. You think you are because you have been for so long, but you are not. Delphine Kettleman came to see me last week. She told me what she told you. And now you know, and I know, and Orrin Whitfield knows, and Sheriff Thorne suspects. That is 4 of us against 1 of him. Hesper wiped her face. She nodded. The first big storm arrived on the 18th of November, and it changed everything. By nightfall, the wind was screaming. By morning, the thermometer at the cabin porch read -9. Hesper had moved everything up to the cave 3 days earlier, but there had still been things at the cabin: preserves, dried meat, cornmeal, a small trunk of Silas's papers. On the 3rd day of the storm, when the wind finally lulled at midday, Hesper went down to the cabin. She left the children in the cave with Barnaby. She rode down through knee-deep snow because when she came around the last bend in the trail and the cabin came into view through the pines, she stopped. The cabin was gone. Where her home had been, there was a black scar in the snow. Beams, ashes, the stone chimney standing alone like a bad tooth. Hesper dismounted slowly. She walked forward. She stood in the ashes of her home and she stared at the chimney, and she saw where the shelf above the stove had been. She thought about the 3 tin cups. She thought about Silas's cup standing upright at last on the morning she had turned it back around. She dropped to her knees. She sifted through the still warm ashes with her bare hands. She found it after a long time. A piece of blackened, melted tin, twisted almost beyond recognition, but she knew the shape of the handle. She knew the small dent in the rim. It had been a cup once. Hesper knelt in the snow and the ashes of her home, and she held the ruined piece of tin against her chest, and she cried. Not the small, silent crying she had done alone at night for the past year and a half. Something larger, something older. She cried until she was empty. Then she stopped. She stood up. She put the piece of melted tin into her coat pocket. She understood with a clarity as clean and cold as the winter wind exactly what had happened. Prosper Kettleman had gambled that if she had no cabin to retreat to, she would come to him for shelter. He had been wrong. She had one home left in the world, and it was made of stone, and her children were in it, and they were warm, and they were alive. She got back on her horse. She rode up the mountain without looking back, and in her coat pocket against her heart, the melted tin cup traveled home. Hesper did not tell the children about the cabin. Not that first day, not that first week. She rode up the mountain in the fading light with the wind clawing at her coat. By the time she reached the cave, her face was raw and her hands were nearly frozen. She stood outside the vestibule for a moment before she went in. She wiped her eyes. She took the piece of melted tin out of her pocket. She looked at it in the last gray light. Then she wrapped it in her handkerchief and tucked it back into her coat, and she went inside to her children. Verity was reading by the stove. Wren was building something out of scraps of firewood. Barnaby lay across Wren's feet. They looked up. "Ma," Verity said, "your face is so cold." "It is cold out there, sweetheart." "Did you get everything from the cabin?" Hesper knelt down by the stove. She kept her face turned toward the fire. "I got what we needed. The rest will keep. We will not be going down again for a while." Verity looked at her. Verity was 11 years old, and Verity had always been the kind of child who noticed. She did not ask any more questions. She simply closed her book, and she came over, and she picked up her mother's cold hands, and she began chafing them between her own. Wren said, "Ma, look what I made. It is a house for the wooden dog." He held up his construction. It was a small square of firewood roofed with a flat piece of bark. "That is a very fine house," she said. Her voice caught. "That is the finest house I have ever seen." She had understood a thing on the ride up the mountain that she had not fully understood before. Prosper Kettleman had wanted her to be afraid. He had wanted her to see the ashes and to feel small and alone. He had wanted her to arrive at his store with her hat in her hand. She was not going to give him that. She was going to keep this cave warm. She was going to write everything down in her notebook. She was going to hold until winter was over, and then she was going to walk down that mountain with her children and her dog and her records, and she was going to see justice done. That was the whole plan. That night, when both children were asleep on the platform under the red-striped blanket, Hesper took the wrapped piece of melted tin from her coat pocket. She unwrapped it. She looked at it for a long time by the light of a single candle. Then she got up. She walked to the stone shelf that she had built into the wall of the cave above, where the 2 upright tin cups sat, hers and Wren's. Verity had brought her own cup, a small china one that had been her grandmother's. Hesper set the melted piece of tin on the shelf gently beside the other 2. She stepped back. The whole cave was very still. "You are still here, my love, all the way through." Then she turned down the candle and went back to bed. The great cold came in the last week of December. The mercury dropped to 27 below on Christmas Eve. It dropped to 31 below the day after Christmas. The wind rose on the 28th and did not stop for 5 days. In the settlement below, the effect was terrible. Old Cornelius Ashby was found on the 29th by his son sitting upright in his rocking chair. He had run out of firewood in the night. He was 79 years old. Sister Marietta Poe lost 3 fingers to frostbite when she tried to walk out to her privy. The Thorne family ran out of coal on the second day and burned every stick of furniture they owned. At Whitfield's sawmill, Orrin Whitfield gave away his last cord of wood to a family with a newborn baby, and then his own fire ran low and his father, old Malachi Whitfield, took a chill that would not lift. The whole valley suffered. Up on the mountain, inside the cave, the thermometer never dropped below 45 degrees. Not once. Not through the worst of it. Hesper kept her notebook. Outside -29, inside 48. Fire burned 2 hours in the morning. Fire burned 2 hours at night. That was all. The stone held, the wool held. The offset vestibule turned the wind aside. The children played and read and slept. Verity read all the way through Little Women again, and then began reading it aloud to Wren, doing different voices for each of the March sisters. Wren, who had been unable to sit still for more than 5 minutes a year ago, sat perfectly still to listen. Wren asked one afternoon whether Ma was still Ma or whether she had become a witch when she made the cave warm, because witches make caves warm in the storybook. Hesper laughed. It surprised her. "I am not a witch, my sweet." "Then how did you do it?" "I paid attention. I paid attention to what killed your father, and I decided not to let it kill anyone else." Wren considered this. That is what a witch would say. Then he went back to arranging his wooden dog. On the 3rd day of the great cold, Barnaby saved their lives. Hesper had gone to sleep just after supper. Verity and Wren were both asleep. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals. The temperature outside was 30 below. Barnaby, who normally slept, curled at the foot of the platform, got up. He walked across the cave. He stood by the stovepipe looking up. Then he came back to the platform and he took the corner of Hesper's blanket in his teeth and he pulled. Hesper woke. She lay for a second, disoriented. Barnaby pulled again. She sat up. She could tell at once that something was wrong. The fire was not drawing. The air in the cave felt heavier, thicker, as if it were tired of being air. She swung her feet down and reached for the lantern. She lit it. She walked to the stove. She opened the little iron door. The coals were sluggish. The draft was gone. She looked up at the stovepipe. She listened. She could hear the wind outside, but she could not hear the small, steady whistle of the pipe. Somewhere up on the roof of the mountain, snow had piled around the chimney cap. Snow had blocked the draft, and in a sealed shelter, a stove that cannot breathe is a stove that will fill the space with poison. Hesper did not panic. She woke Verity. She spoke low and calm. "Verity, listen to me. The chimney has snowed over. I have to go up top and clear it. I will not be long. I need you to stay here with your brother. I need you to keep the vestibule curtain shut behind me." Verity was awake and clear-eyed at once. "Ma." "Yes. I want to hold the rope." Hesper looked at her daughter. She had planned to tie the rope to a stone anchor by the door. She had not planned to have Verity hold the other end. But Verity was looking at her with a face that was pale and set. "Ma, I want to hold the rope, please." Hesper nodded. She got the coil of hemp rope from where it hung. She tied one end around her own waist with a bowline knot. She handed the other end to Verity. Verity, without being asked, wrapped it once around her wrist, then twice, then she tied it to her own belt. Wren, who had woken up, sat up on the platform. He crawled over to Verity, silent. He put his arms around her waist from behind, and he held on. Verity said in a voice so small Hesper almost did not hear it, "I will not let go, Ma, not like the night Papa left." Hesper stopped. She turned and looked at her daughter. Verity had never said anything like that. Not once. Not in the whole long year and a half since Silas had died. She had never spoken of that night. Hesper crossed the cave in one step. She knelt in front of Verity. She took her daughter's face in her hands. "Verity Ashcombe, you did not let go of your father. Do you hear me? You held on. You held on all night. It was not your holding that let him go. He went because it was his time, not because of anything you did or did not do. Do you understand?" Verity's eyes were full. "I understand, Ma. You have never done anything but hold on to me, to your brother, to your father. You have been the strongest person in this family since the day you were born, and I have never told you that plainly, and I am telling you now." Verity's mouth trembled. "Please go clear the chimney, Ma." Hesper kissed her forehead. She stood. She pulled on her mittens and her hat and a wool scarf that covered everything but her eyes. She stepped out through the vestibule. The wind hit her like a hand. She crawled. She had learned that on the first practice run in November. When the wind was over 40 miles an hour, you did not walk. You crawled. You stayed low. She crawled along the base of the cliff. She reached the small ladder of pine poles that led up to the top of the outcrop where the stovepipe emerged. She climbed. The wind tried to peel her off. At the top, she found what she had feared. A drift had built up on the leeward side of the outcrop, and it had grown high enough to bury the little iron cap over the stovepipe. She dug. She dug with her hands, and with the short-handled iron shovel she had lashed near the top of the pipe for exactly this purpose. She cleared the drift. She scraped the last crust of ice away. She angled the wind deflector. She waited a moment. She listened. She could hear it now, the small, steady whistle of air the pipe was drawing. She climbed down. She crawled back to the cave. She dragged herself through the vestibule, and Verity was there, and Verity untied the rope with hands that finally were shaking. And Verity did not say anything at all. She just stood in front of her mother and looked at her with an expression that Hesper would remember for the rest of her life. Wren was crying hard the way small children cry when they have been holding it in for a long time. Barnaby was pressed against his legs. Hesper knelt down. Her coat was crusted with ice. Her eyelashes had frozen. She pulled Wren into her arms. "I am here, my sweet. I am here. I am home." Wren clung to her. Verity, without a word, went to the stove and stirred the coals. She added a fresh piece of pine. She watched it catch. The flame steadied. It brightened. The three of them and the dog sat around the stove. And after a while, Wren stopped crying. And after a while longer, Hesper felt her hands begin to hurt again, which meant they were warming up, which meant they were still hers. She thought about the plan she had made in the summer, the plan for wool and firewood and stone. She thought about how the plan had almost broken. She thought about how it had not broken, because a dog with a good nose had known, and a child with a strong grip had held on, and a mother had crawled out into a killing wind. That was the plan in the end, not stone, not wool, not fire, love doing the work. I want to stop the story here, because if you are anything like me, your heart is beating a little faster than it was 2 minutes ago. Have you ever had a moment in your life when you had to be brave? Not for yourself, but for someone else. A moment when you were afraid and cold and tired, and you did the thing anyway because the person you loved needed you to. I know some of you have. I bet some of you are thinking of a specific moment right now. I would love to hear about it. Just tell me in a word or two what you did that day. Now, let me tell you about the morning Hesper Ashcombe walked down a mountain to save the man who had once been afraid to look at her. The wind broke on the morning of the fourth day. The sun came out. The sky was the color of a robin's egg, sharp and bright as an axe blade. Hesper stood at the mouth of the vestibule at mid-morning and looked down at the valley. She could see chimneys faintly through the trees. Some had smoke rising from them, some did not. Whitfield's sawmill was in the middle distance. She could see the outline of the mill building and the low ridge of the roof of the Whitfield cabin behind it. There was no smoke from the cabin. She stood very still. She waited. The air was almost still. There was no wind to blow the smoke away. There was no smoke. She turned and went back into the cave. Verity looked up. "Ma, something is wrong at Mr. Whitfield's. There is no smoke from his chimney." Verity set down her book. "You are going to go?" "I am." Verity did not argue. Hesper packed. She took 2 full canteens of water. She took cold biscuits and hard cheese. She took a folded wool blanket. She took a bottle of the elderberry syrup Lavinia had given her. She kissed both her children. She patted Barnaby. "You are in charge of both of them," she told the dog. Barnaby thumped his tail once against the floor. She left. The walk to Whitfield's sawmill took her almost 3 hours in the deep snow. She followed her own trail down. She reached the valley floor at the ruin of her own cabin. She did not stop to look at it. She turned east and began breaking a fresh trail through drifts that reached her waist. By the time she came in sight of the Whitfield place, her chest ached and she was breathing white clouds like a horse in winter. The place was silent. The sawmill was still. The great water wheel was locked in a shell of ice. The cabin had no smoke. Hesper walked up to the door. She knocked. She knocked again, harder. "Orrin! Orrin Whitfield! It is Hesper Ashcombe. Open the door." She heard faintly a scraping sound inside, then slowly the door opened. Orrin Whitfield stood in the doorway. He had a heavy blanket wrapped around his shoulders. His face was gray. He had not shaved in days. "Hesper," he said. His voice was rough. "You should not be here. May I come in?" He stepped aside. The main room of the cabin was cold. There was no fire in the great stone hearth. The furniture had been pulled together into a tight cluster in the middle of the room. On a cot under a mound of quilts lay a very old man. He was small, he was thin. His white hair was combed neatly. His hands were folded on his chest. His eyes were closed, but his chest rose and fell slowly. "Malachi," Hesper said softly. "He has been asleep since yesterday afternoon. He drank some broth this morning, not much. Where is your firewood?" Orrin looked at the floor. "I gave the last of it to the Wallace family 2 days ago. The baby was cold. I thought I could bring more up from the shed, but the snow and the wind. I could not get to the shed, and then Father took the chill, and I could not leave him." Hesper closed her eyes for a moment. She set down her pack. She took off her mittens. "Orrin Whitfield, listen to me. You and your father are coming with me. Right now. You are coming with me to the cave. There is room, there is warmth, there is food, and there is help." Orrin looked at her. She could see him trying to think of a reason to refuse. She could see the pride in him. It was the pride of a man who did not know how to accept help without feeling that he had failed. She took his hand. It was very cold. "Orrin, I know how it feels. I have not been able to accept help either. Not for a long time. I refused it from everyone, even you. Do you remember when I came to the mill for the boards? You wanted to bring them up yourself. I almost refused you. And I would have been wrong. Refusing help when you need it is not strength. It is pride wearing a costume. She squeezed his hand. Come with me. You are not a burden. You are a friend, and I need you to be alive when the winter is over. And so does everyone in this valley who still needs a sawmill. Oren did not answer, but his shoulders came down just a little. He nodded once. All right. All right. They spent an hour wrapping Malachi in every blanket in the house. They lashed him onto a small hand sled. Then Hesper Ashcombe took the front rope of the sled and Orrin Whitfield took the back, and they began to pull an old man up a mountain in the snow. It took them the rest of the day. They arrived at the cave just as the last light was leaving the sky. Verity was waiting at the entrance. She had a lantern lit and a kettle boiling. She did not ask any questions. She just held the vestibule curtain aside, and she helped her mother bring an old man into the warm. Malachi Whitfield was awake and drinking broth by the middle of the following morning. He sat propped up on the sleeping platform with pillows behind him. Verity had heated a stone in the coals of the stove, wrapped it in flannel, and tucked it against his feet. Wren had brought him the wooden dog to hold, because Wren believed that the wooden dog had powers of healing. Malachi held the wooden dog on his lap and thanked Wren gravely. Then he looked around the cave. He looked at the sleeping platform. He looked at the wool curtains. He looked at the small dark iron stove. He looked at the wood rack. He looked at Verity reading. He looked at Wren building. He looked at his son sitting on a low stool with a mug of hot tea in his hand. He looked last at Hesper. Mrs. Ashcombe. Hesper looked up. Mr. Whitfield, my son Orrin has told me a great deal about you. Silas told me a great deal about you back when he was alive. He was a fine man. He was proud of you. He used to say that you were smarter than he was and that he had married up. Hesper's mouth trembled. She did not answer. I want to say something. I hope you will let me say it. I am 78 years old and I have earned the right to speak my mind, I think. Please, Mr. Whitfield. Malachi lifted a thin hand. When my Anna died, I was near 40. I thought my life was over. I raised my son alone from the age of 9. He is a good son. He has been a good son. But when his own wife died in childbirth 3 years ago, I saw him do what I had done. I saw him close up. I saw him stop looking at the world. And I did not know how to reach him. He looked at Orrin. Orrin looked at the floor. Malachi looked back at Hesper. I am not asking you for anything. I am not asking my son for anything. I am only saying that I have watched in the last 12 hours the strangest thing. I have watched my son laugh at a boy's joke about a wooden dog. I have watched him accept a bowl of soup without arguing. I have watched him fall asleep in a chair by the fire while a stranger's child read out loud beside him. I have not seen those things in 3 years. And I wanted to say out loud in front of you and him and God that I noticed. There was a long silence. Wren said, Mr. Malachi, would you like some more broth? Yes, my boy, I would like some more broth. Wren went to fetch it. Hesper did not look at Orrin. Orrin did not look at Hesper. But when Wren came back with the broth, Orrin's hand brushed hers once as they both reached for the wooden bowl. Neither of them pulled away. The nights in the cave were long. Malachi slept early. The children slept curled together on the platform with Barnaby between them. Hesper and Orrin sat by the stove. They did not talk much most of those nights. There was not much to talk about. But on the third night, Orrin looked into the fire for a long time. My wife's name was Cora. She was 31 when she died. We had been married 8 years. We had lost 2 children before, both of them very early. This was going to be the one. She wanted a boy. She had picked a name. She wanted to call him Silas, after your husband. Hesper's throat closed. He never knew, she managed. No, we never told him. Cora wanted it to be a surprise. She held on to that moment for a long time, all the way to the end. Orrin looked at the fire. After she died, I could not go to your cabin for a long time. I could not even ride past it. And when Silas himself got sick, I stayed away. Because I thought in some stupid corner of my mind, if I could just stay away, none of it would touch me again. He stopped. I was a coward, Hesper. You were a man who had lost everything. That is not an excuse. It is not an excuse. It is an explanation. There is a difference. He looked at her. She held his gaze. Orrin Whitfield, I will not pretend I am not glad you are here now. I am a widow of 45 years old, and I have 2 children asleep on that platform. I am not looking for a man to save me. I do not need saving, but I would be glad when this winter is over to sit at your table sometimes, and I would be glad if you sat at mine. That is all I have to offer right now. Is it enough? He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were wet. It is more than I deserve. That is not for you to decide. He laughed softly, a short, tired laugh. He reached across the small distance between them and took her hand and held it gently on the top of his knee. She did not pull her hand away. Barnaby at the foot of the platform lifted his head, looked at them, and put his head back down. I want to pause the story for one more moment. I know some of you have been alone for a long time. Some of you have lost husbands. Some of you have lost children. Some of you have lost the person who once knew you best. And I know some of you have wondered in the quiet whether it is too late for another beginning, whether you are too old. I want to tell you what I believe. I believe love does not check a birth certificate. I believe the heart at 65 is the same heart that was at 25, only wiser. I believe that Hesper Ashcombe at 45 in the middle of the coldest winter of her life was not too old for anything. I believe you are not either. If this thought sits with you tonight, I hope you will tell me so. And I hope if there is a lantern in your window, you will keep it lit. You never know who is walking in from the cold. The storm broke fully on the 5th day. The temperature climbed painfully slowly from 20 below to 10 below to 5 below. The world, which had been muffled and silent for a week, began to wake up. And in the middle of the 6th day, Delphine Kettleman climbed up to the cave. She came alone. She had ridden as far as her small brown horse could go. Then she had walked the last mile in snowshoes. She reached the mouth of the cave in the middle of the afternoon. Hesper came out to meet her. Delphine's face was set. She had a small leather case under her arm. She was not crying, but her eyes were the eyes of someone who had been crying for a long time and had stopped and had decided something. Mrs. Ashcombe, Mrs. Kettleman. Delphine looked at her. I am not Mrs. Kettleman. Hesper waited. May I come inside? I have to tell you something. I have been carrying it for 2 years, and I cannot carry it one more day. Hesper led her in. She sent Verity down to sit with Malachi and Wren out of earshot. She sat Delphine on the wooden bench by the stove. She poured her a cup of hot water and dropped a pinch of mint into it. Delphine held the cup in both hands. Her hands were shaking. Prosper Kettleman is not my husband. He is my brother. Hesper set her own cup down slowly. He has a wife in Chicago? He owes a great deal of money there. He fled. When he came west, he brought me with him and told everyone I was his wife. He said it would look better. A married storekeeper would be trusted. He said if I did not agree, he would tell certain men in Chicago where our father is living. Our father is not a well man. He was a bookkeeper for a company that failed. He never took $1 he did not earn. But Prosper convinced those men that our father had taken a great deal. That is why our father has been in hiding for 4 years in a small town in Wisconsin. She took a shaky breath. I have not been Prosper's wife. I have been his prisoner. Hesper reached out and put her hand on top of Delphine's. I am so sorry. You are the first person I have told in 2 years. Delphine opened the leather case. She took out a thick sheaf of papers tied with a piece of twine. These are copies. His real ledger, his false ledger, letters he thought he had burned, his deed to your cabin, the one he forged after he burned it. He tried to file it at the county office the day after the fire. She pushed the papers across the bench. He burned your house. Delphine's voice broke. I heard him planning it. I did not stop him. I did not warn you. I will carry that with me all my life. I am so sorry. Hesper looked at the papers. She looked at Delphine's face. She thought about how much courage it had taken for a woman who had been afraid for 2 years to bring a leather case up a mountain in the snow. She stood up. She walked around the bench. She sat down beside Delphine and she put her arms around her and she held her for a long time while Delphine wept. You did warn me, Hesper said finally. You warned me in October when you brought me the first ledger. You have been warning me all along. Do not carry this. Do not. He is my brother. He is not your keeper. Delphine wept harder. Verity from the far side of the cave watched with quiet eyes. She did not come over, but when Hesper looked over at her daughter, she saw Verity nod once as if she understood, as if she were already becoming the woman who would someday hold these things. That evening, Delphine slept on a pallet by the fire. Barnaby slept beside her of his own accord. Hesper watched him do it and thought again that dogs know things. The meeting at the church was set for the first Saturday of the new year, 1 week after the great storm broke. Word had gone out through the valley. The subject was to be the matter of the fire at the Ashcombe cabin and the accusations Prosper Kettleman had been making. He had told the sheriff and anyone in his store who would listen that Hesper had burned her own cabin in a fit of grief and madness. He had produced, he said, a deed proving that Silas Ashcombe had signed the cabin over to him in the last week of his life. He had produced the deed. It looked to the untrained eye entirely legitimate. Prosper Kettleman came to the church in his best coat. He sat in the front pew. He was smiling that same small patient smile. Sheriff Marcus Thorne came in his uniform with a heavy leather book under his arm. Reverend Hollingsworth stood in the pulpit. Hesper walked in with Verity on one side and Wren on the other. Behind her walked Lavinia Threadgood and Orrin Whitfield and old Malachi Whitfield leaning on his son's arm. Behind them walked Delphine. The church went quiet. Prosper Kettleman turned in his pew. His face, when he saw Delphine, changed just for a second. Then the smile came back. But Hesper saw it, and Sheriff Thorne saw it, and so did every woman in that church who had ever seen a certain kind of man's face when a certain kind of thing was taken away from him. The Reverend called the meeting to order. He read the accusations: arson, fraud, neglect of children. He asked Hesper in the tone of a man performing a duty he no longer believed in, whether she wished to respond. Hesper stood. She walked to the front of the church. She was not a large woman. She was 45 years old, and she was dressed in a plain wool dress. She did not look to anyone in that church like a formidable figure. She looked like a widow. She turned to face the congregation. "Reverend, neighbors," her voice was quiet, but it carried. "I did not burn my house." Silence. "I did not sign my house over to Mr. Kettleman. My husband did not sign it over. My husband was in his fever and could not lift a pen in the last week of his life. I fed him with a spoon. I know what he could do and could not do." She looked at Prosper. "But I understand that words are not enough, and I did not come here today to speak alone." She turned. "Sister Threadgood." Lavinia stood. She walked to the front. She held up her leather satchel. She took out a stack of papers. "These are my medical records for Silas Ashcombe. They cover the 6 weeks of his illness. I sat with him 7 times. In the last week I was there 4 times. He could not sit up. He could not swallow solid food. He could not have not swallowed solid food. He could not have signed a deed." She set the papers on the pulpit. Hesper turned. Sheriff Thorne. Sheriff Thorne stood. He walked to the front. He set his heavy leather book on the pulpit. He opened it. "I have here a record of every deed filed at the county office in Boise for the past 2 years. I checked it myself last week. There is no deed on file transferring the Ashcombe cabin to Prosper Kettleman. There is a deed filed after the fire that Mr. Kettleman attempted to enter. It was rejected because the notary who signed it does not exist. There is no notary by that name in this territory." He closed the book. Hesper turned. "Mrs. Kettleman." There was a stir in the church. Delphine stood. Her legs were shaking. Anyone could see it. She walked slowly to the front of the church. Prosper Kettleman moved to stand. Sheriff Thorne, without seeming to hurry, was somehow already standing between Prosper's pew and the aisle. Prosper sat back down. Delphine reached the pulpit. She looked out at the congregation. She was pale. Then she opened her mouth, and in a small, clear voice she told her story. All of it. The false name, the brother in Chicago, the father in hiding, the false ledger, the plan to seize half the valley. The night she had heard Prosper describe how easy it would be in a storm to make a cabin catch fire on its own. She spoke for almost 20 minutes. The church was completely still. When she finished, she set the leather case on the pulpit. "I will testify to all of this. In any court, on any oath. I have been afraid of my brother for 2 years. I am not afraid of him anymore." She stepped down. She walked past the front pew where Prosper sat with a face that had gone bone white to the pew where Hesper was standing. She sat down. Hesper sat down beside her. She took Delphine's hand. The reverend at the pulpit looked at Prosper Kettleman. He looked at him for a long time. Then he turned to the congregation. "I have been a preacher in Silverthorne Hollow for 11 years. His voice was hoarse. "I believed when I signed that petition in November that I was protecting children. I was wrong. I am asking Mrs. Ashcombe in front of this congregation for her forgiveness." Hesper looked up. She met his eyes. She did not smile. She did not nod. "We will speak of it another day, Reverend. Today we have other business." He inclined his head. Sheriff Thorne turned to Prosper Kettleman. "Mr. Kettleman, I am going to ask you to come with me now." Prosper Kettleman did not resist. He did not speak. He walked out of the church with the sheriff beside him. He did not look at his sister. He did not look at anyone. That was the last time most of Silverthorne Hollow ever saw him. He was held in the county jail for 6 weeks. Then before his trial, he escaped and he fled east, and word came back the following summer that he had died in a boarding house fire in Kansas City. Some folks in the valley said the fire was too neat to be an accident. Some said it was the men from Chicago catching up to him at last. Hesper never learned the truth of it. She did not care to. What mattered was that he was gone. The valley did not heal all at once. Some things it never healed. Old Cornelius Ashby did not come back. Sister Marietta Poe's fingers did not grow back. The Ashcombe cabin was not rebuilt until the following June. And even then when it was rebuilt by many hands over many weeks, with lumber that Orrin Whitfield brought at his own cost, with chinking that Lavinia Threadgood mixed with her own hands. They built it back with a small vestibule at the door. They built the woodshed on a raised platform. They set the stove deep in the main room with a stone shield behind it. They built it in short the way the cave had taught them. Every family in the valley made small changes that summer. Sister Bettina Crane put a second inner wall in her cabin. The Wallace family built a windbreak of pine boughs on the north side of their house. The Thornes dug a root cellar deeper than they had planned and lined it with wool. No one called them cave ideas. They were just folks said sensible. Reverend Hollingsworth preached a sermon on the first Sunday of April on the subject of humility. It was not a very good sermon, but it was, everyone agreed, a sincere one. He came to the cabin rebuilding in May with a bag of nails he had bought at his own expense, and he swung a hammer poorly for an entire day. Hesper did not entirely forgive him, but she nodded to him when they passed in town, and that was as close to forgiveness as she was going to come, and it was enough. Delphine stayed in Redbud Crossing. She took over the general store once the county sorted out that Prosper's accounts had been fraudulent. She used the true ledger to settle the debts fairly. She forgave the ones that had been invented outright. She opened a small dressmaking shop in the back room because she had been a dressmaker in Chicago before her brother had needed a wife. She sent for their father in Wisconsin. He came in the fall. He was a small, gentle man with white hair and glasses. He sat in a chair by the store's front window every afternoon and greeted every customer by name within a week. Lavinia Threadgood took Delphine under her wing. They became inseparable. They were in their own quiet way the two most powerful women in Silverthorne Hollow. And Hesper. Hesper spent the rest of that winter in the cave. She spent it with her children and with Barnaby, and often with Orrin and sometimes with Malachi, who grew stronger through February and was walking on his own again by the middle of March. She had used less than 1 quart of wood the entire winter. Down in the valley, the families who had struggled had used 2, 3, sometimes 4. She had lost no one. She had frozen no fingers. She had watched her son grow an inch and a half. She had watched her daughter read 17 books. She had watched a very old man come back from the edge of dying. She had watched a broken man begin slowly to laugh again. She had watched herself become someone she recognized. The mountain had kept its promise. The last scene of this story is a small one. It happened on a bright morning in the last week of April. The snow was mostly gone from the lower slopes, though the peaks were still white. The creek was full and loud. The first bluebells had come up in the meadow behind the cave. Hesper had come up that morning to close the cave for the season. She was going to take down the wool curtains. She was going to bank the stove. She was going to fold the red striped blanket and carry it down to the cabin, which was still being built, but which had a roof now. Verity had come with her. Verity was 12 years old now. Her birthday had passed in the middle of March in the cave with a small cake Lavinia had brought up and a book of Emily Dickinson poems that Orrin had ordered all the way from Boise. Wren had come too, and Barnaby. There was mud on Wren's boots and a smear of something green across his cheek, because that was Wren and because it was spring and because there were frogs in the low places. Verity carried the 2 upright tin cups outside and set them on a flat sunlit stone. "To warm them," she said. "For tea." Hesper stood in the cave. She opened the small wooden trunk she had kept beside her bed all winter. She reached inside. She took out the folded handkerchief that held the piece of melted tin. She unwrapped it. She held it in her hand. The last time she had really looked at it that first night in November, she had wept. She had thought her heart would not hold what it needed to hold. She looked at it now. She looked at the twisted shape of what had been a cup. She looked at the small dent in what had been the rim. She thought about the man who had drunk his coffee from it every morning for 15 years, the man who had brought her west from Ohio, the man who had told her in the last letter he ever wrote her that she was stronger than she knew. She did not weep this time. She only smiled. She carried the piece of melted tin outside. She set it down on the sunlit stone, right next to the 2 whole cups, not as a cup anymore, as what it was, as a memory given permission to sit in the light. Wren, coming up from the meadow with a frog cupped in his hand, saw it there. "Ma, is Papa's cup out for the sun, too?" Hesper looked down at her son. "Yes, my sweet. Today is the day your father comes outside with us." Wren considered this. He looked at the 3 cups, whole and broken, sitting together on the stone. "That is nice," he said. Then, remembering the frog, he held it out for his mother's inspection. "Look, his name is Reginald. That is a very fine name for a frog." "He is a very fine frog." Wren wandered off, muttering to Reginald about the mud. Verity was standing a little apart watching. Her hair was longer now. She looked at her mother, and she looked at the 3 cups, and she smiled a small, quiet smile that was very like Silas's. Then she looked past her mother down the trail. Orrin Whitfield was coming up the slope. He was carrying a small canvas bag on his shoulder. He had shaved. He was walking with an easy step. He raised a hand when he saw them. Verity did not say anything. She looked back at her mother. Hesper felt her face color just slightly. He said he might bring some flower seeds," she said, "for the cabin garden." Verity nodded gravely. "Yes, Ma." There was a pause. Then Verity walked over to her mother, and she took her mother's hand, and she held it. And when Orrin reached the flat, sunlit stone a moment later, out of breath, but smiling, Verity, without being asked, held out her other hand to him. Orrin looked at her. He looked at Hesper. He took the girl's small hand in his own large, work-hardened one. The 3 of them stood there for a moment. Wren came running back with Reginald the frog. "Mr. Orrin, come see. There's a whole family of frogs. There is a mother and a father, and I think 6 babies." Orrin let go of Verity's hand. He crossed to the boy. He crouched down in the mud. He listened seriously to the story of the frog family. Verity leaned against her mother's side. "Ma," she said quietly. "Yes, I think it is going to be all right." Hesper put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. She looked at the 3 tin cups sitting in the sun. She looked at the man crouched in the mud with her son. She looked at the mountain behind her, which had held her all winter in a room made of stone. She thought of Silas. "Yes, my love, I think it is going to be all right." The wind moved through the pines above them. Somewhere in the meadow, a bluebird sang. And below them in the valley, the smoke was rising from every chimney in Silverthorn Hollow, and every window had light in it, and every door was open to the spring. Hesper Ashcombe never wrote a book. She never filed a patent. She raised her two children on the same piece of land where her husband had built their first cabin, and she and Orrin Whitfield married in the fall of the following year in a quiet ceremony that Lavinia Threadgood insisted on catering in the front yard of the rebuilt cabin, with only the closest friends invited, and with Verity as the maid of honor, and Wren as the ring bearer, and with Barnaby wearing a small blue ribbon that Wren had tied around his neck, watching gravely from the porch. They had no more children of their own, but Orrin loved Verity and Wren as his own from the day he moved in, and they loved him back. By the time Wren was grown, he could not remember quite honestly a time when he had not called Orrin Pa. He remembered Silas, too. He had a photograph on his mantelpiece all his life of a man in a wedding suit with a mustache and kind eyes. He knew that man had been his first father, and he told his own children so. Verity became a teacher. She taught at the schoolhouse in Redbud Crossing for 41 years. She married late in her mid-30s to a doctor who had come out from Chicago, and she had one daughter whom she named Hesper. The cave stayed open. Every winter, Hesper walked up to it once in the deep cold just to sit in it for an hour. She did not bring anyone with her. It was her place. She sat on the stone bench she had helped to build. She listened to the wind moving past the mouth. She thought about Silas and about Orrin and about her children and about the strange, hard, holy winter of 1887 when she had learned that she was not a woman to be pitied, and she was not a woman to be sold, and she was not a woman to be moved out of her own life by a man in a fine coat with a false ledger. She was a woman who had built a home in stone. She was a woman who had held on. She lived until she was 79. She was buried in the spring of 1921 in the small graveyard behind the church at Redbud Crossing beside Orrin, who had gone 6 months before her, and near Silas, whose grave she had tended every May for 34 years. Her last words spoken to Verity, who was sitting by her bed, holding her hand, were reported to be, "It is not so bad, sweetheart. It is just a doorway." She smiled and she closed her eyes and she went through. "I want to say something to you now before I let you go. If you have listened all the way to the end of this story, I want you to know I am grateful. I know it was a long one. I know some of you were listening while you cooked or while you cleaned or while you sat by a window. I know some of you were listening in bed in the dark because the house was too quiet. I hope Hesper Ashcombe kept you company tonight. I hope if you are in your own winter, in whatever shape that winter is taking, that you heard something in her story that reminded you of yourself, because I believe most women are stronger than they know. I believe most of you have already survived things you never thought you could survive. I believe most of you have carried more than you were ever meant to carry. And you did it anyway because there were people who needed you and you loved them, and that was enough of a reason. I believe there is a cave in you too, a place made of stone, a place that will not freeze, a place where the people you love can be safe if you will build it. And I believe you can build it even now, even at whatever age you are, even if it feels late. It is not late. It is never as late as you think. Before you go, I would love to know one thing. What is the winter you have already come through? Just tell me in a word or two in the comments. I promise I will read every one of them. If this story meant something to you, would you share it with one woman you love, a sister, a friend, a daughter, a neighbor, someone who might need it tonight? I will be here again soon with another story. Until then, keep the lantern lit, keep the door open, and whatever comes to your mountain this winter, my dear one, remember Hesper Ashcombe. She built her home in stone, and so can you. The end.